Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that I checked out from my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. It is a book about geckos and fictional past. I am referring to The Book of Chameleons by Jose Eduardo Agualusa, and this was published in 2004. For those who don't know, Jose Eduardo Agualusa is a multiracial writer who was born in Angola, which is a country in Central Africa. I had actually not heard too much about Angola before reading this book, and so I was able to look up some of the past, and that actually helped me understand this book a little better, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in the analysis section. But Jose Eduardo Agualusa is a writer from that region. He's been writing for quite some time. And he mainly writes in the Portuguese language, as Angola was settled by the Portuguese, and thus many of the people speak Portuguese. And so this book was actually translated into English by someone named Daniel Hahn. I don't know too much about them. Probably should know a bit more since they're the one translating it, but I didn't care to do a whole lot of research into that person's life. But Jose Eduardo Agualusa is also a journalist, and he frequently talks about history and like the myth making of history in his writings, which you especially see a little bit today, which is pretty interesting. Although he does also deal in magical realism, and he cites Jorge Borges as one of his influences, and he's a pretty well-acclaimed South American writer. And I'm not really familiar with Borges, so I don't know if he's successful here in channeling him or not. I think I'll leave that up for you if you were to go check out this book. But without further ado, let's talk about the Book of Chameleons. I will do a summary, a brief analysis, and we will move on from there. So the Book of Chameleons primarily focuses on an albino man named Felix Ventura. He is an Angolan man living in an Angolan village. He's a forger of sorts, although he doesn't like the term forger. He creates fictional backstories for the elites of society. People come to him who may have humble backgrounds, and they ask him to change their background so that they may come from more noble parentage or something like that, noble history, which is quite unusual because you think people would be able to see through that, and he, as it turns out, like he's really good at what he does of doing this, and so it's a way for the elites in Angolan society to escape from whatever sadness might be in their past. And what's interesting about the story is it's told from the perspective of a gecko who lives in Felix's house. This gecko apparently has had multiple lives, might have been a human in a previous life, and apparently sees all in his household and can see through the lies that the characters tell. One day, a stranger shows up and asks for Felix to create an invented past for him. He's a photographer of sorts, but the stuff that he's asking for kind of alarms Felix because he's asking him to forge an entire life for him. And Felix is hesitant at first, but he decides to go along with it, creating the idea of Jose Bookman for the stranger, and the stranger begins to ask more details about this life, apparently wanting to be like completely enmeshed in it, and this is who he is now, which is very strange. Like he ends up going away and coming back and telling him that he found his father's headstone in another city, which shouldn't be real because this is a fake identity. And he says he's going to New York to find his long-lost mother because he was an orphan as a child. And he ends up finding like traces of her in New York City and around the world. So while he's taking pictures for his job, he hunts her down. And again, like, this shouldn't be possible. Like, who is this woman that he's tracking down? But it seems like this, like, in a bit of magical realism, he's created this real fictional life out of a life that shouldn't have existed at all. And while all this is going on, Felix talks to the gecko about his past, how his father was a romantic, and how his mother warned him of the dangers of real life and encouraged him to seek out fiction. So Felix really loved books because they weren't real, and because his mother warned that, like, real life could hurt you, reality could be dangerous, and so that is not something that you really want to get involved with. At the same time that all of this is happening, the gecko and both Jose and Felix share dreams where they have conversations. I'm not really sure what's happening in these dreams. They reveal parts of their lives within it, but I don't know how much of that is true, and what exactly is really happening in those dreams, what they symbolize. But they're there, and this is definitely part of the book. We later learn that Jose is meeting his fictional family, again, his mother and his father, and stumbling into people that he shouldn't actually know in his background. Felix meets a woman named Angela Lucia, who he develops a relationship with, but it's clear that both of them are kind of lying to one another about their past. Not really willing to acknowledge what has happened in their past as well as Angola's past, but they seem to love each other, so things are pretty good there. And also in this story, Felix ends up giving a new life to a minister, but it's suggesting that, like, this person who's going to be high up in Angola's, like, leadership has a past that isn't real. And so how many people are like that for the country of Angola, and what does it mean that Angola's past is completely made up? We also learned that Jose has run into a person named Edmundo Reyes, who turns out to be a character from his actual past. Jose is apparently was tortured by Edmundo, who is a person in a high position as a minister in Angola, and Edmundo killed his wife in the process, and it turns out that Angela is Jose, or the person, or like Pedro as he's really called, is Angela is his daughter, and in the process of killing his wife, Angela was born. And Edmundo took that child away, gave her up for adoption, and Edmundo's been hiding in secret this entire time in the hopes that after the revolution and the civil war that happened in Angola in the 70s and 80s, that this would all die down and people would forget about it. But Jose remembered, and as the story draws near to an end, Angela shoots Edmundo in the chest for what he did, and then she leaves, but she writes postcards to Felix, suggesting that she's doing something else with her life. And the gecko also dies, and Felix writes in his journal about how the gecko had a soul and was destined for sort of great things, or its soul is going to be transferred over to something else. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And Felix remarks that he hopes that rather than living a dream or something like that, that he has made a dream for himself and others. And that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there's a little bit to talk about here. It's a pretty short story, but I do think that to some extent, Agualusa makes the most of his time with this book. One thing that he talks about, though, is the idea of choosing fiction over reality for any number of reasons. So in the story, Felix creates fictional backgrounds for clients for some reason or another. Like, ministers come up to him, celebrities come up to him, even a photographer like Pedro or Jose, like they want a different life, either because they come from humble backgrounds and that's not enough for Angolan society, or their past is too tragic and they want to do their best to forget it. But even if Felix were to change that past, like, and draw up a new one for them, which he's not physically doing that. Like, he's not altering the past in any meaningful way. He's just writing it out on paper. Like, you're still going to know about where your past came from. And I think maybe that's Jose's highlighting the absurdity there of trying to escape your past by having someone else merely tell you that you lived a different life. Or that you have these papers that say you're from somewhere else. It's very unusual. But all these clients want a fictional life. So why choose fiction over reality? And I think it comes down to a number of potential answers. It could be an escape. You don't like the life that you lived, and so you want to live this different life. Or the real past is too bland, or something like that. Like it's not eccentric enough for the people of Angola or wherever you're from, and so you've got to spice it up a little bit. Like, instead of just being from a family of farmers, you're now from a family of revolutionaries, or people who were pretty high in the government once it was first created, which creates a number of ethical issues, I'm sure, with what Felix is doing by lying and saying these people are who they aren't actually are. But another reason that I think that people are choosing this fiction over reality, this created past, is that the reality is too harsh for them. That life provides too much hurt, and you have to escape it through any way possible by creating this fiction that is actually positive for you. There's a quote from this. Allow me to read it to you. Reality can hurt us, even those moments when it may seem to us to be a dream. You can find everything that exists in the world in books, sometimes in truer colors and without the real pain of everything that really does exist. Given a choice between life and books, my son, you must choose books. And that's what his mother, Felix's mother, tells him in the story. That reality is too harsh, and you can find everything in books anyways. Like, all the themes and feelings of reality that I might very well be discussing right here, you can find in books. So just choose books over reality, because reality is just only going to hurt you, which is a pretty harsh thing to tell your child, because that's not gonna help make them a functional adult when they grow up. But maybe that's why everyone's choosing that fiction over reality. This grand illusion of who they are versus what they actually are. Because if a minister comes from these grand backgrounds rather than these painful backgrounds, where they fought revolutionaries or had to kill people or something like that, that's kind of hard to face. And that, I guess, that relates to Angola, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments here. But the reality of living their actual life might just be too harsh for them. But there's also a danger of living this fictional life, of lying about who you are and not being truthful or owning up to the past that you actually lived. I like that Jose kind of acknowledges both things here, how you might want to escape into that reality, but there's a danger of assuming too much of that fiction. And that happens to Edmundo in this story. Rather than acknowledge that he played a part in the terrible things that happened during the revolution and the civil war that followed, he merely lived a lie for the next 20, 30 years. And the result of this was his death. Because he did not acknowledge who he was, Jose Buchmann was angry at him. Pedro was angry at him. And Angela ended up shooting him in the chest. Which is a harsh outcome for him. Like, that's not going to happen to everybody, but not acknowledging the reality in which you lived it's offensive to a lot of people, and it only leads to further problems when the truth is finally revealed, as it was in this story. Would he still have been attacked by Jose or Pedro or Angela if he did own up to his past earlier? Maybe not, probably, but it's better to acknowledge it then and than to just let it drag on and create all these years of hurt feelings and growing tension. which is probably a really big problem in Angola. And I love that Jose Agualusa is willing to touch on that. Another thing worth talking about here is Angola's history. I didn't know a lot about Angola before reading this book, but I do think it's important to know Angola when getting into this and trying to understand the history and how it affects what's happening with these characters. In Angola's history, there's a lot of tensions from colonization. A lot of countries in Africa dealt with colonization and the struggle for independence. I talked about that with A Grain of Wheat as I think another story as well. And what was it called? The Shadow King by Maza Mengiste. That was really good. All dealing with the effects of colonization or imperialism. And then there's the civil war that followed the revolution because different factions wanted control of Angola. And eventually there was a government that formed out of it, but that government dealt with a lot of corruption, like even to the present day. And Angola is dealing with that corruption, but a lot of people believe that it's political in nature, that the people in charge might be jailing their political rivals. Even though they're corrupt, it's not right to do that sort of thing. So the people of Angola have to constantly deal with this murky history, that even after they got their independence, things didn't turn out the way they would hope. And in the story, characters lie to avoid their consequences of their actions and to avoid confronting what they might have done in the war. You can see how unhealthy that would be for Angola. That if you constantly deny the reality of Angola, of its history and its people, you're not going to confront the what you need to confront with its history, that people may have murdered family members or that there's inherent corruption in the system. That's what's happening to America. Like, we refuse to acknowledge the terrors of racism and the Civil War and slavery and stuff like that. And it's leading to further harm in our overall culture because our politicians don't want to confront this unfortunate event. So you can see that happening for Angola too. And I do have to wonder, like, the ultimate question is, like, is there hope for Angola in this story? I would say I hope so, that maybe the country can confront its the misdeeds and the actions of everyone in the past in a beneficial way that, while uncomfortable, allows it to thrive down the road. But if that's not working for us, and if these are how people are choosing to think and creating these fictional lives, then it seems like Angola just wants to wish the terrible past away, and that's never going to happen because there's always going to be that uncomfortable after effects of the Civil War and the revolution that took place. So a lot of uncomfortable stuff that's focused on in the story, but very necessary if you're someone who loves Angola, like I think Jose Agualusa does. But there are still some issues with this book. I feel that it's too disconnected at times, and largely because there's no real plot. Like, there are things that happen in the story, but nothing drives it forward, apart from the observations of the gecko in this story, which is kind of weird. Like, there's dream sections, and none of it really makes a lot of sense to me, especially because some of the characters are vague. Like, Felix is an interesting character, Angela Lucia is very interesting, even Jose Pedro is an interesting character, but they're all kind of vague, and I feel like Jose Agualusa could have spent more time on these characters to flesh them out more, to give them life and make me care about them in some regard. And related to that is also the narrator of the story, the gecko. Like, why have the narrator be a gecko? What's his entire deal? It feels a little bit like a gimmick. And also, you call it the Book of Chameleons, but you cite that the narrator is a gecko. And so what's the deal with that? Like, shouldn't the narrator be chameleon, or shouldn't the book called the Book of Geckos? I don't know. Maybe it just has a cooler title. But I feel like the gecko, there could have been more done with the gecko, and actually, like, what does it mean that this gecko used to be a human being? It's a bit unclear. It just seems more magical realist than anything else. Like, it's just there to be there rather than having an actual narrative or even aesthetic purpose. And then the last thing worth noting is that Jose Agualusa definitely cites Borges as his inspiration for this story. But if you're someone like me who has never read Jorge Borges, before any of his stories, then this is going to feel unfamiliar and really hard to get into. Like, I don't know if he's appropriately channeling Borges, or if this is kind of a mess, but it does feel more messy than appropriately channeling anything. But again, I guess your enjoyment of this will vary depending on if you've read Borges before. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the Book of Chameleons by Jose Eduardo Agualusa. A pretty interesting book, although I feel like it's held down by its flaws with the vague characters and the disconnected kind of thoughts and plots of the story. I'm not going to say it's bad by any means. I'm just not going to recommend it. You might find some enjoyment out of it if you're familiar with the work of Borges, or if you've read Agualusa's other stories. But personally for me, like, this wasn't my fancy, and I don't really know anyone who would be interested in this sort of thing. But if you have something different to say, or if you've read this before and you like it, let me know in the comments. Let's have a discussion about the Book of Chameleons. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that maybe someone else can find out about this book and potentially read it if it is their thing. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and fictional travels. Farewell.